Welcome to Double Fries No Slaw, December 8th, playoff selection day, Richie, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. In a little bit better mood than we were maybe a year ago today when we did this episode. Rougher year, but maybe a better mood. But Double Fries No Slaw, we are presented by Guthrie's. You can visit all three of their locations: 1818 West Tennessee, 2550 North Monroe, and 2870 Appalachia Parkway. Richie, let's jump into it, man. How's your weekend been?
Been pretty good. Did a whole lot of nothing. Yesterday was actually a pretty phenomenal day of college football. If you're just watching for the entertainment value, enjoyed all the games. The SEC championship was phenomenal. So was the ACC championship. Those are the two main ones I watched. But yeah, it was just nice to be on the couch all day yesterday. Church this morning, and a whole lot of nothing today. How about you?
Yeah, pretty chill weekend. A lot of college football. Watched all the championship games. Same thing. Church this morning. Bucks win today, which
Yes.
was good.
Wait, quick question: Were you able to watch the Bucks game? Because it was not on in Orlando. They had the Jaguars game on, which really frustrated me because this is the first year I don't have the NFL Sunday ticket.
So I'm a degenerate and just watch Red Zone. So
Okay.
because I'm usually working on stuff, setting up doing all this stuff, getting the kit, I just leave Red Zone on in the background so that I'm not locked into a game. So yeah, I don't even know. But in Tampa, I'm sure it was on because of where I am location wise. So, but anyway, yeah, a good mood. For Florida State fans, the best week of the season so far since really we were in Ireland, just because the season's over, couldn't lose this weekend, and then a fairly good week. Here's maybe a good start point. So, Florida State over the last few weeks, Richie, we talked about this, but Florida State was in a position to have the worst recruiting class of our lifetimes, right? They obviously didn't measure classes the way that they do now back in the day, but even those classes were obviously much better because you just look at the talent that Florida State was bringing in. And, and I said this on a few shows, want to get your take on it, and we'll talk about some of these guys, but it truly felt like this staff cared more about recruiting in the last 2 weeks than they did in the last 3 or 4 years. I don't know. I don't know if it was an intensity thing. I don't know if it's just Florida State's got a brand. And they've got a good NIL with the battle's end. And so that you're able to flip some guys late, but what they did on the recruiting trail, I mean, you could preface it by saying that, a top 20 class is not the standard at Florida State. Absolutely. There's no doubts about it. A top 20 class, when you go 2-10 and are kind of just in the absolute dumps with no idea who coaches are going to be, guys are signing without coaches, this, that, and the other, a top 20 class in that perspective and looking at it from that angle is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I thought for sure we'd finish around 35 to 38. But to have all the flips that you did, part of me wonders, when a program gets a new coach, right? They typically get a bump in that first class. Well, when you completely revamp your coaching staff, did Florida State get a bump from that? Was Mike Norvell able to go on the trail and sell that? Listen, we have all new coaches essentially, and we're ready to go, and you can be part of the solution as opposed to being part of the problem, which we all got rid of. So it was a surprisingly good thing because I did not see that happening at all. And when you look at some of the schools that Norvell and the staff flipped kids from, it's pretty impressive. And, part of me, the pessimist in me thinks that, well, how many of these kids were pushed out of their classes? But I do think a lot of them would have been takes if they wanted to sign with the schools they were committed to. And for Florida State to flip kids from LSU, Auburn, Ole Miss, really good high profile programs, that's encouraging moving forward. Again, you got to do better than 2-10 next year, obviously, but to get those flips after 2-10, that's pretty impressive to me.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at what you did, obviously there were several on signing day and in the signing period, but then just zooming out, really what you did over the last 2 or so weeks, Yeah, to 8 total flips, unless I'm missing one. Boggs from UCF, a 4-star wide receiver. Arnaud from Auburn. That was certainly not a push out. That's a kid that Florida State was in it for. Boggs obviously coming over. Malzahn obviously had a lot to do with that one. He absolutely went off for, I believe it's Coco in their state semifinal, and now they'll be in the state championship game. A really talented wide receiver. Arnaud, a kid that you had some juice with in the summer, picked Auburn, ended up coming to Florida State. Harold from LSU, another big pickup. Gelsey, kind of a mutual parting of ways there with UF, like that. That I don't know if that's a true flip, kind of the same way as Tramel Jones is more of a mutual parting of ways and then ends up somewhere else. But you bring in Gelsey. Cromaz, the big one from UGA. You absolutely needed a running back commit, and I think the running back room is still kind of TBD, but you picked up a kid that is really, really talented and could make a pretty big impact for you next year. Picking up Lee from Ole Miss was big, kind of unexpected. That was one that I don't know that you thought you were definitely going to get. You picked up an offensive lineman that was committed to USF. I know that's not one that is super sexy or everybody is like jumping over doing backflips for, but you picked him up. And then Sperry from Oklahoma. You flipped a quarterback too. And again, did you maybe settle at quarterback? Like, do I expect Sperry to come in and just light the world on fire? No, I think he's a developmental piece that'll take some time, but you still flipped a quarterback from Oklahoma. And so 8 flips down the stretch to get from, we were saying, right? I would have been, if you'd have told me we'd have a top 25 class, even just 2 weeks ago, I'd have said, yeah, I just don't see it, right? I don't see how that's possible. And to get into the top 20 on 247, 19 on 3, I believe, is pretty impressive. And it kind of speaks to me, we talked about, can Mike Norvell turn this around? Obviously, there's a long way to go, and I don't think anything is settled just yet. And he's going to have a lot of work to do, right? I think he does figure things out for this year. Like, I actually would take my percentage up over 50 that he is the coach in 2026. Like, I'll buy that. I don't know if you have a take there or not. Is he the coach in 2030? That's kind of what I talk about when I think about like turning things around completely. Like, when we're in a new conference, is he the coach? That's what I'm probably more like TBD on. Is he really like the long-term guy at Florida State, which I hope he is. I like Mike. But I do feel more confident about the direction that they're heading right now with some of the coaching hires, with the emphasis on recruiting. And so I think that, just what they've shown really just in the last couple of weeks of, cleaning some things up from a coaching perspective, finishing as well as you could. I believe only 2 programs had top 20 classes that had losing records, one of those being Auburn, which Auburn were they 5-7, Harlan? I don't know if you want to fact check me on that or if they went 4-8, but obviously at least double Florida State wins, if not 2.5 times if they won 5. To get into that top 20 at 2-10 is pretty impressive. And I'm not going to sit here and predict that, 2026 class, they're definitely going to be top 10 or anything like that. But I do think that there's a chance that we see the recruiting uptick some. I don't know that this will ever be like an elite recruiting staff. I don't know that you're ever going to see this staff put together top 5 classes, certainly not back-to-back top 5 classes. You would need to really capitalize on some things and win a lot of games, I think, to get back in those kind of conversations. But you certainly need to recruit better than most of the ACC, and they did that, right? They out-recruited the ACC champions. They out-recruited SMU, who was in the ACC championship. The only ACC team they're behind is Miami, and Miami finished with about a 14-15, the 14th or 15th best class in the country, based on what site you're using. And so you're 4 or 5 spots, 5-6 spots behind them. And so you're certainly in a better spot than even the most optimistic FSU fan would have thought you would have been in.
Yeah, I think it's pretty telling that, it was probably Florida State's best closing on a signing day since Mike Norvell has been here. And it was coming off a 2-win season where you kind of got embarrassed in many games. Sure, a couple were close and could have been, if a couple things go differently, you might have won those games. You talked about the running back from Georgia who flipped. Man, I was watching his highlight film and I got excited. He reminded me a lot of a more fluid James Wilder Jr., just the way he runs and tosses people. I think that was huge. But yeah, just the fact that you somehow ended up in the top 20 which I think a week ago when we were on here, we both were kind of in agreement that there's no way this team or this class ends up in the top 20. I was thinking like maybe if we're in the top 40, that'd be awesome, but we did not end up there. And especially doing it while a lot of these coaching hires had not been announced yet, right? We'll get into those shortly, but you had a half-empty coaching staff, and you're still flipping these guys. And I think Mike Norvell understands now the need to truly go after the high school recruitment, right? The high school athletes and build that from the bottom down, which is what all the elite teams do. He struck gold last year by just hitting hit after hit after hit in the portal. And I think he realizes now, after seeing what his portal hits from a year ago that played for Florida State this year did, he says, okay, no, I need to go to high school and get kids. And there's definitely a place for the transfer portal. And I think he will continue to utilize that. But you need to improve your high school recruiting. And it'll be interesting to see. I'm not sure Florida State gets a top 10 class next year because a lot of these kids nowadays, they make their commitments during the summer, and you're still a 2-win team by come this summer. But to your point, you were saying, will he be here in 2026? I think so. Will he be here in 2030? He's got a lot of work to do, TJ. He really does.
You mentioned the portal, and obviously that opens up this week. And I just wonder if they can carry some of this momentum over to the portal. And we've talked about this. I was at, somebody in one of the pastors at church asked me this weekend or this morning, like where did it all go wrong? Like what happened this year? And I was like, I don't know, man, we've been trying to figure that out for 3 months now. Yeah. But I do think a large portion of what went wrong this year was Florida State's just struggles or maybe even complacency in the portal with thinking that guys were just going to be beaten down the doors to come to Florida State because of what we had done with Jared Verse and Keon and Tatum and guys that, Fintrell, guys that had come in. And I want to see the aggressiveness we saw in this last 2 or 3 weeks closing in this high school class. I want to see that translate to the portal, and I want to see their aggressiveness because there are certainly some massive holes on this team that need to be filled and need to be cleaned up before we get to next year, or else we're going to be in another really rough situation. I don't think they're going to win 2 games again next year, but if they don't address some of their issues, and then if they don't attack the portal with true difference makers, right? Not second and third options because you slow play guys or because you don't want to pay up or just whatever your situation is, right? Whatever the reason was that Florida State struggled so bad in the portal last year, if they can attack that and use some of that same aggressiveness and use some of that same momentum to attack offensive line, defensive line, and then I see questions about quarterback. Would quarterback be something that you go and get? I think that is pretty dependent on who you can get, who you can bring in, and what you think that does to your ceiling. I think that if you can attack the portal with the same aggressiveness that you just attacked the end of the recruiting class with, you can be in a lot better shape. Honestly, Richie, if Florida State can clean up offense and defensive line through the portal, which is no easy task. I'm not sitting here saying that like that's an easy thing to do, but if they can go out and get a tackle or 2, if they can go out and get a really good edge prospect and a good defensive tackle prospect that you can pair with some of your young guys that you've developed or brought in, then I think they can be looking at a much higher floor for next year. To me, the floor for next year really needs to be a bowl game. It needs to be 6-6, and the ceiling needs to be 8-9 wins, right? And that's kind of, to me, a successful year is somewhere between 6+ and 9, 10 would be pretty optimistic. But in our year-to-year college football, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities. No idea what Miami's going to look like. No idea what Bama's going to look like. No idea what Florida's going to look like. I think, outside of the billion fumbles, you played Florida as well as they played you in that game. And so there's no reason to think that if you shore some things up, you can't compete with any of these teams. Clemson, I still think, is going to be pretty tough on the road. But in our year-to-year college football that we live in, I'd like to see them attack the portal as aggressively, and obviously there will be a lot of portal news. I would expect Florida State to take 20 guys in the portal this year. when it's all said and done, if not more. And so that is probably what's most intriguing to me because, yes, you closed well on the recruiting trail. I don't know how many of the guys that you brought in this recruiting class are going to make massive differences for you in 2025. There are a couple. Chroma is one. I think Kevin Wynn is one that could make an impact. I think some of your edge prospects are guys that could make an impact, Lee and others. But if you don't get things right in the portal along the trenches, we're going to be in a rough situation next year too. And so that is probably the biggest question mark I have right now. It's not really coaching anymore. It's not really this, that, and the other. Quarterback's up there, but it's what do they do in the trenches when the portal opens?
Yeah, and it's frustrating. And, obviously Odell, has stepped down from his on-field position. But, man, you on paper should have had a top 5 defensive line in the country this year, and you just didn't. And now you got to go reload that position. And the offensive line, the coaching staff was completely fooled. They thought that they had, at least the top 10, top 15 offensive line in the country. They probably weren't top 75, top 80. And looking at next year, we were kind of had the schedule here. Great podcasting. Your conference schedule's not that bad. Yeah, you get Clemson and Miami, but you get Pitt, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, NC State, Stanford, and Virginia. You know, there's a alternate universe where Florida State could make the college football playoff next year if they get to Charlotte. It'll be tricky. But SMU, nobody thought they were going to Charlotte this year, and they were a last-second field goal away from winning the ACC championship game. And we know SMU is going to build on this and spend a ton of money because they're probably the richest school in the ACC by far. But to your point, TJ, Florida State has to build on the trenches. I'm not worried about defensive back. Linebacker, we could use some help there. But even running back, receiver, quarterback, if there's one that's available, you take him. But the trenches is where games are won and lost. And that's where Florida State, when we were in Ireland, TJ, and Florida State just got dominated by Georgia Tech in the trenches. And that was the difference in the game. And you only lost by 3 points on a time expiring field goal. If we had better trench play, we win that game. And I don't know if the season goes a whole lot differently, but you don't win 2 games. You might win 5 or 6, which is still essentially a fireable offense in my opinion. But, you're not going to fire a guy when you owe him $68 million, whatever it is. And next year owe him, probably 50 something million if you wanted to fire him. But yeah, I think the portal, if Norvell can find a Keon Coleman, a Jermaine Johnson, a Keir Thomas, a Jerrion Jones, which he magically found all of those in a very, very short time frame. If he can land just 1 or 2 of those, then yeah, I think next season could be a decent season and one that I will be excited about.
Yeah, no, it's definitely more optimistic. And again, your schedule sets up fairly well for you. We didn't look at this schedule as terribly difficult this year. I believe almost every team that Florida State played this year went to a bowl. And so the schedule wasn't like top heavy where you were playing just incredibly elite teams. You did play 3 teams that went to the playoffs. So, it wasn't necessarily the easiest ever, but Florida State did end up having a pretty difficult schedule. A Georgia Tech team that took Georgia to 8 overtimes, an SMU, a Clemson, a Notre Dame that went to the playoff, a Florida team that certainly was playing their best ball at the end of the year, a Cal team that beat Auburn and a BC team that went to a bowl. And so you played a little more quality teams, Miami team that won 10 games. I mean, the list goes on and on. You played a fairly decent schedule, a top 20 schedule in the country this year. I think that lightens up a little bit next year. So, hey, over 300 people in here watching live right now. Certainly do appreciate you guys. If you are watching, whether you're an FSU fan or an FSU hater, we appreciate you for spending your Sunday evening with us. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. It does help the channel out a ton. It doesn't really cost you anything outside of a click. So if you could do that for us, we certainly would appreciate it. And we'll continue to show up here on Sundays, no matter if the team wins 2 games or 200 games in the season. So, all right. Let's talk a little bit about coaching hires, Richie. The Seminoles. We talked about this last week. We talked about Malzahn, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on this one because that one had already been announced. It was confirmed by Florida State, and then Florida State confirmed 3 other coaching hires too. Tony White, defensive coordinator from Nebraska; Terrence Knighton, defensive line coach from Nebraska; and then Evan Cooper to coach safeties as well. So Florida State brings in 3 coaches. My biggest takeaway maybe from this, because I've talked about White, I've talked about Knighton, and I haven't really talked about Cooper a lot. I'm not going to pretend to know just a ton there. I do believe that people think of him as a pretty good recruiter, and I think that should help. But in the Cooper news, it sounds like Surtan's staying on to coach cornerbacks and still be part of the staff. Now, I will say this. I don't want to be the ultimate pessimist, and I'd love to be wrong on this. It wouldn't surprise me if when the NFL jobs start to open up in January and later on, it honestly wouldn't surprise me if Surtan still was maybe gone later based on what offers in the NFL may come up, may not come up. Obviously, the NFL coaching carousel is much later. So I don't want to etch in stone Pat Surtan staying on this staff indefinitely. However, it does sound like he's staying now and not going anywhere. There's not like a head coach job at Southern or something that he's going to take right away, which I do think is a positive. I think that his development at the cornerback position is really important. And the longer you have him on staff, the better. Is he here when we kick off against Alabama? I don't know. But I do think that Florida State's done a good job of hiring coaches. There is obviously more that needs to be done there. They're not done hiring coaches, but some pretty good headway made so far in coaching hires.
Yeah, and I think Nebraska, they've not been a great program, but their defense has been pretty solid. I think a top 20, and if you look at yards per game, um, I think that bringing in Tony White is a really good hire. And I love the idea. A lot of people might disagree of having a corners coach and a safeties coach, because they are 2 completely different positions. And a lot of people think, oh, it's just a secondary. No, it's not. They are the schemes and everything, and how well he works with Pat Surtain. If he does stay at Florida State, which as of right now, you think he would, but at the same time, TJ, I think any sane person would rather be an assistant in the NFL than an assistant in college, where you have to recruit and deal with NIL and the transfer portal and all of that nonsense. In the NFL, you don't even have to worry about recruiting because you have a general manager who puts your roster together and you get the entire summer off. So that's a no-brainer for me. I know some people just love the college grind, which is fine, but I've been very pleased so far. I want to see how they recruit, but I think, Mike Norvell, I like how quickly he's acted, whether it be Malzahn, White, or anyone else, and seeing how excited some of these assistant coaches are to come to Florida State. And that might just be for social media or whatever, but, I do think they're excited to be here, and I really look forward to seeing what they can do in the next, year or two here in Tallahassee.
So Florida State's certainly not done hiring coaches.
Nope.
And still need a wide receiver coach, still need an offensive line coach. And the portal opening, is it tomorrow? Is the portal actually open tomorrow, or is it midweek? I don't know. It opens this week.
Wednesday.
Yeah. And so I think you need to get those hires in place pretty quickly. It sounds like they've bounced around on a couple of wide receiver coaches. Offensive line still not done either. Maybe they were waiting for conference championship weekend to be done. I don't know that I'm super confident in that or not. It just kind of needs to be done. But to me, offensive line is your biggest need, and wide receivers are a pretty big need as well. And, listen, I'm not firing Norvell because he hires a coach 2 days after I think a coach should be in place. I'm firing him because he went 2-10. No, I'm just kidding. But I do think that it is of the utmost importance to an offensive line hire probably needs to be announced like Monday or Tuesday. And wide receivers probably pretty close to that. Like if that's a day or two later, that's fine. I know that Mike and Gus will work a lot on the wide receivers. And so that I'm not as it's got to be done this second. I like a lot of the young talent at wide receiver. To me, an offensive line hire needs to be, whether it's announced by Florida State or not, which that usually comes, 2 days after, Pete Thamel or just whatever nerd nationally breaks the news, which I obviously still don't like Pete. But that needs to be leaked, announced, whatever. That needs to be broken, like, I don't know, within 48 hours. Hopefully we're back on here very quickly doing another video on who the offensive line coach is, because to me, that one is detrimental, because if you don't strike, I'll just say it, gold in the portal, if you don't do well in the portal at offensive line, I have a hard time seeing 2025 go very well. Wide receiver, I'm not as freaking out. I'm not freaking out as much about getting that in place. Offensive line, I think, needs to be in place like yesterday.
So here's what I'll say. I think, we all had a very nice honeymoon phase with Alex Atkins, but he clearly did not develop these players. I do think you have some talented offensive linemen on the roster already that, with a good spring camp and then fall camp, could be much, much better next year. And what I love about the Gus Malzahn hire is he runs the ball every single place he's ever been. So I think Florida State will be able to run the ball next year. He can scheme it open. And I think you just need some development. And again, I was a huge Alex Atkins fan. I don't have anything bad to say about him, but he clearly did not develop these players. Darius Washington was talked about as a potential preseason All-American. He was terrible. You look at Maurice Smith, who was, a serviceable player at center, but still not. None of these guys got better, in my opinion, on the offensive line throughout the time that Alex Atkins was here, which sucks because I thought, I loved posting the picture of him smoking a cigar when we got an offensive line, right? That was awesome. But I just think, if Gus can bring a hand with him, that would be awesome. If it hasn't happened by now, I don't think that's going to, but that's just my speculation on my part. But yeah, you need to absolutely get a home run hire on the offensive line coach, someone who can develop and recruit. And those are extremely difficult to find, but he's got to figure it out.
Yeah, got to do it quickly. I think those need to be in place quickly. I'm sure what will happen is I'll clip this segment up and put it out first thing tomorrow morning about, like, man, are we ever going to hire an O-line coach? And then it'll get announced like an hour later and we'll get 1,500 comments on this. Like, we just hired one. And I'll be like, well, this was actually.
Her hand is here.
So I don't think it's hand, just for what it's worth. But if you're watching this and we've just hired somebody, we recorded this at 6:37 on Sunday night. So it's just coming out a day later. Give us a little bit of a break. But yeah, confirmed portal opens up tomorrow. So it is actually the 9th.
Tomorrow. Okay.
Obviously, guys are going to take visits. You've got some times to set some things up. But I mean, as you saw in the case of Solomon Thomas, I mean, if Florida State would have had an offensive line coach in place, do you end up signing a 5-star offensive lineman? Maybe, obviously he has to like that guy, but and how much of a relationship does he develop with that guy in 48 hours or whatever? But that's already kind of cost you once. You can't let it continue to cost you. You've got to get those guys in place right away. So we'll see what Florida State does there with the coaches. Quick note too: Tony Tokar's Yak and Chris Thompson. Seems like they'll be around. I don't know. To me, like, we've had our thoughts on that. If Mike wants some continuity on the offense, that's fine. I think if you could upgrade any of those positions, you probably should. If Mike doesn't feel like he can, his focus is on wide receiver, offensive line, then I understand it, and we'll kind of roll with some of the coaches that were on this staff previously. I kind of wonder how numbers work out too. You've obviously hired some new coaches. We didn't talk about this, but moving Odell to off field, but you still have one too many if you have a safeties and a cornerbacks coach. And so how does that end up shaking out? What do you end up doing with that? Obviously Shannon has been let go. Are you hiring a linebacker coach too? You probably need to cut more, but how or where do you do that? We'll kind of see what ends up happening with that. So, hey, I do want to give some love in this holiday season over to Garnet and Gold. If you're shopping for any FSU gear, make sure that you're shopping with our friends over at Garnet and Gold using our code NOSLAW, NOSLAW. It's December 8th, so you have 17 days to order and get your stuff. If you're in the state of Florida, the stuff comes like a day or two after you order, so they do a phenomenal job shipping stuff out quickly. If you order $75 or more, you get free shipping. And then, of course, with our code NOSLAW, NOSLAW, you get 15% off. You should not be shopping anywhere else this holiday season for FSU gear. Make sure that you're shopping with Garnet and Gold. We appreciate their support of our channel for sure. All right, Richie, let's move on quickly to this. I want to talk about one more thing, FSU specific, and then we'll talk some big picture stuff. But some draft announcements have come out. Got some guys going to the NFL, and one that kind of hurts a little bit, but just very expected. And then two that I think are probably the best for everyone involved. AZ Thomas goes to the NFL. Certainly, in talking with some people, think that he could be probably a day 2 pick, but a top 100 pick. I think that he's going to test incredibly well and has a ton of potential. So it kind of stinks to see him go. I wouldn't have mind backing up the Brinks truck and bringing him back for another year just because he's so good out at corner. I do like a lot of our young guys. And then Farmer and Jackson also made their intentions known to go to the league. Haven't seen anything with Pat Payton yet. Again, that'll probably drop as we're recording this because that's just how things work out. But those are the 3 that have declared for the draft. Josh Farmer, who I do think, is it best for all parties involved that Farmer probably same thing with Jackson. I think Farmer played pretty well this year. His effort was still there. What kind of leadership were you getting there? I don't know. Jackson, kind of the same thing. I thought he played okay down the stretch, but 3 guys headed to the NFL. I actually think all 3 get drafted. AZ Thomas, I have no doubts about. Farmer, I'm pretty sure too. And I think Jackson will test well, and I think he's got a lot of upside, high potential, maybe around 4, 5, 6 guy. I don't think he's like a high pick by any means, but I actually think all 3 get drafted. And, best of luck to those guys. Did they have the season, that they wanted this year? Did we do the things that we wanted to do? No, but I, certainly am not going to wish ill for any of those guys and hope they do have successful careers in the NFL.
Yeah, no, with Farmer and Jackson, it's again, the defensive line, to me, even more so than the offensive line this year, was the biggest disappointment of the team because I thought they were going to be a completely dominant group. I thought the offensive line would be solid, had a chance to be really good, and they were a disappointment as well. But I think the defensive line was more of a disappointment. And I don't think when you talk about Farmer or Jackson, I don't think they ever had their heart in that Florida State. They wanted to play college football at a high level, and they wanted to make as much money as they could, which I have no problem with at all, because I would do the same thing. But they were never fully invested, in my opinion, in Florida State. But yeah, AZ Thomas, that's the one that burns a little bit. And I agree with you. His combine numbers are going to be off the chart. He might get drafted a little earlier than his game film suggests based on how he's going to test at the combine. So, it's crazy. We're only talking about 3 guys going potentially being drafted after last year. We had 11 or 12 guys drafted. But that's kind of how quickly things turn around in the college football world these days. But yeah, to your point, I don't wish ill will on any of these players. I wish, Farmer, Jackson, and AZ certainly all the best, and I hope they all get drafted high and make as much money as possible, get a nice signing bonus. But we'll see what happens.
I do think. I think Pat Payton gets drafted too. Do you think? I think Pat Payton.
If he leaves, he will. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think that his upside. He certainly didn't play super well this year, and certainly was frustrating at times. Just whatever. I'm not trying to be a jerk or anything, but yeah, I do think he can get drafted. And so I think you're looking at 4 guys getting drafted. Okay, here's one. Obviously they're out of eligibility, right? But could Fitz or Mastro get drafted?
I don't know if maybe a 7th round, but that's tricky because how often do NFL teams pick a kicker or punter when they know they can easily find one that is as a UFDA? So I don't. I think Fitz has certainly earned that. I mean, the Bucks were dumb enough to take Roberto Aguayo in the 2nd round, and nothing against Roberto. I love him, but a 2nd round on the kicker is wild. But Fitz had a phenomenal season. He should win the Groza.
Yeah. And Mastro should win the Ray Guy as well. So, it would be it would be funny if that's how Florida State got to, 4 or more, 5 drafted if
Our
one of those
punter and
2
place kicker get drafted.
Some portal announcements as well. I'll run through them just really quickly. On scholarship, I'm not as worried about the guys that were, walk-ons or whatever that jumped off. But Durijai, the transfer from West Virginia, never really played this year. Announced for the portal today. Byron Turner, kind of a developmental piece that there was maybe some promise that sometimes just never really, was a massive impact guy. I think you're kind of over recruiting that position. I think they did a good job with edge prospects. As much grief as we've given JP for recruiting, they did a good job down the stretch here with a couple of edge prospects that they're pretty excited about. Duke Cooper announces for the portal. Jackson West, longtime tight end, announces, and then Deuce Spann had announced in late November as well. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scholarship guys leaving through the portal as well. No real shockers there, and I expect more. We've dropped more in the Discord, guys' names that we kind of expect will also jump in. I think those announcements are going to continue to trickle out, especially once the portal opens tomorrow or today if you're watching the clip. But we talked last week about guys that we didn't want to see go. AZ Thomas was kind of in that grouping of guys we didn't want to see go, but we kind of knew at that point like what was likely coming. And so I thought so far so good, right? I've heard some names, I've heard some whispers of guys that are coming back that were kind of in our grouping of guys we didn't want to see go, young tight ends, young DBs, different people here, there, wherever. But so far with both the draft and the portal announcements that we've gotten, nothing that concerns me, nothing that's like, oh man, UF had a DB jump in that they were like, oh man, that guy's kind of a good DB. I think they've recruited that position well. They'll be fine. That's not even a shot at UF. But so far, so good. We'll see, though, tomorrow when the portal opens, if anything changes or anything gets crazy. But so far, so good. Nobody that has jumped in or left that I'm just heartbroken about or didn't expect. Again, I'd love to have Thomas back. In all reality, I think we've done pretty good so far to start with the portal. We'll see if they can continue to keep the guys together that they want to keep for the future.
Yeah, and I'll never be upset about a kid who decides to, try and take his talents to the next level and going pro, as opposed to one who you'd love to keep who enters the portal. But there's not been a single player who has entered the portal who I said, dang, man, that's going to hurt us next year. And that's no shot against these guys. They might be a better fit somewhere else. I think back about, Jeff Luke, who was a 5-star linebacker who committed to Florida State, had some drama with USC, but ended up actually signing with Florida State and played here, but it never worked out here. He went to Cincinnati and led the country in tackles the next year. So sometimes you do need a change of scenery, but there's nobody so far, knock on wood, that's entered the portal that I'm like, oh my goodness, we really could have used him next year. That could change by the time that you listen to this Monday morning. But I wish all these kids the best. I will never have ill will towards any of these college athletes who are just trying to figure things out.
No, I will at times, but I just won't say it on here. No, there's definitely some shade I'll throw here or there. But once they started making, 10x what I'm making, then I'll throw some hate. All right. Again, if you're watching this, do us a quick favor and hit the subscribe button. We certainly do appreciate all those who are in here. Nearly 400 at this point, which is pretty cool for a week we didn't play and, a season that we won 2 games. Some real excitement around FSU. Again, maybe that's because we're not playing and not having an opportunity to lose games. But if you haven't already, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button. Richie, you texted me about this and said that we need to talk about it, and so here we are. The ACC at this point, just absolutely stumping. And I don't know if Jim Phillips hired an entire marketing team or department or whatever to really stump and push for Clemson and SMU and Miami, even the bowl teams that qualified for bowls in this conference. But it is pretty remarkable to see the difference in the way that the ACC pushed for the teams that were in qualification or in contention is the right word this year compared to last year. And it is certainly frustrating to see. I'll say this, as much as I hate the ACC and think Jim Phillips is, not knowing who the quarterback for different teams is and thinking that Jordan Travis is playing for SMU this year and Miami. All of that said, I think it was more so just their unawareness, like their lack of foresight, as opposed to like something that was targeted or because they make more money with Florida State in the conference in the playoff too and stuff. But it is frustrating to watch it this year. When last year, that they just sat there with their hands tucked in their pockets and did nothing to advance the narrative or push Florida State along. And watching it happen this year, which I think Clemson and SMU both certainly deserve to be in the playoff. It is frustrating watching it happen this year, though.
No, it's beyond frustrating because, when you look back to last year, you think about College Game Day, and, my wife and I watch it every Saturday. Even though Kirk is still there, we still watch it. But, Greg Sankey is on College Game Day, the entire month of November, it seems like, every year, pushing the narrative for his teams. And Jim Phillips, if he wanted to be on there last year to help push Florida State's narrative, he could have been on there. They're not going to say no to the commissioner of the ACC. And now their Twitter is just propaganda they were trying to put Miami in too. They were pushing for all these teams. And it's just so frustrating that where was that last year? Because I do think if there was more of a push from Phillips and the ACC social media and other ACC coaches, you noticed Dabo Swinney, one of the first things he said after winning the ACC championship is that SMU is a playoff team. Where was that for Florida State last year? That's why we're in a lawsuit right now. And that's why I cannot wait to leave this conference. But 2 wins sure doesn't help.
Yeah, it was, okay. Yeah. The idea of like, I thought what was a big deal this year for SMU is that the narrative started to be crafted of you just can't from the time that SMU qualified for the ACC championship, which was the second to last week of the season, right? Yep. Their last game against, was it Cal? Didn't even matter. Because they clinched the week before against Virginia. And really from that moment, you started to hear the narrative of, now if they'd have lost to Cal in the last week, obviously things would have changed, but they were a big favorite there. And obviously they ended up winning and winning going away. But you started to hear that narrative of you absolutely cannot leave this team out. This team has done enough already. And that was several weeks prior to this moment that we're sitting in right now.
Where they lost, yeah. By the way.
You started to, with 2 losses, right? In the championship and to BYU. But you started to hear that narrative that this team absolutely cannot be left out no matter what. And it almost just like, I posted a meme earlier today of Florida State kind of taking bullets for SMU. And I almost think that what happened to Florida State helped SMU because it just made people aware of what could happen. When we went to bed in Charlotte, in different houses, that sounded weird. But when we went to bed in Charlotte last year, I did not in my wildest mind think that there was a chance that Florida State would get left out. In fact, I woke up that morning and started tweeting about it's going to be great when we get in the playoff and this, that, and the other. And even ESPN, who obviously controls this whole thing, and really they're the ones that kind of dictate what ends up happening at the end of the day with the committee and everything else. ESPN had Florida State at like a 98% chance to get in that morning. And I tweeted a picture of that the morning of the selection show. This year, they didn't even do that. They didn't do projections and predictions because I was looking for it. I wanted to see what it was for SMU and Alabama and what ESPN was kind of targeting. And this year, they didn't update it after the conference championship games. The last time they updated it was like last week. And so I thought that was interesting that they kind of took their hands off of it and left it alone. And I think it was because of the narrative that had been crafted over the last several weeks of you cannot leave SMU out no matter what. And I just wonder if that same narrative would have been crafted, if the powers that be, because ESPN is a partner of the ACC. Obviously, they care way more about the SEC, and that's where their bread is buttered. But if that narrative had been crafted, and if that was kind of the mindset, and people were aware of it, I do, to give the ACC a little, not credit, but a little slack. I just don't think people even realized that was what happened to FSU was even a possibility of happening. And so I almost think that Florida State falling on the grenade and taking the hit for everyone else is kind of what helps SMU now and probably helps other teams that get in this situation later, whether it be a Big 10 team or a Big 12 team or whatever. I think that it helps. Like say Colorado or say Arizona State would have played an undefeated BYU and Arizona State would have qualified, but BYU would have had their first loss. I think BYU would have slipped in and snuck in, and then somebody else would have gotten left out because of what happened with Florida State. But again, that falls on the ACC, just like they weren't forward thinking enough to sign a good TV deal. They weren't forward thinking enough to protect literally their most valuable entity in Florida State. And is it the only reason Florida State's trying to get out of the conference? No. Is it a big part? Absolutely.
So I'm going to take 30 seconds. I think we're allowed to do this, but I want to play Kirk Herbstreit in what he said today.
Most interesting, in your opinion, as one has, you have lived this sport for decades. Do you think it would be fair to penalize a team because it played an additional game because it qualified for its conference championship?
Well, after last year, I've learned I have no opinions about anything. I think everybody gets a trophy. Everybody gets in. I want no death threats. I want no punishment for 8 months from hashtag FSU Twitter. So I have no opinion on anything. I love everybody.
I thought that was hilarious that he's taking shots at Florida State fans still, and that's fine. And I never thought I would forgive the man, but I'm gone. Like Kirk, you do you. Peter's an awesome dog. So was Ben. So I'm a dog lover. So I'm okay with that. But even hearing him say, like he basically admitted that last year he knew he was running a campaign against Florida State. Death threats are not cool by anyone ever, obviously. So I don't know if he got any, but if he did, then that's shameful. But for him to get the hate that he got from Florida State Twitter, that was very well warranted because he was clearly pushing a campaign against Florida State. And I do think that campaign against Florida State last year is the reason why probably Alabama did not make the college football playoff this year.
Yeah, no, it was very clear. It was very targeted. One last thing on Phillips, I mentioned it quickly, but just funny. And this segues fairly well into what we'll talk about in a minute. But I did think it was funny that this idiot, which whatever, we'll just call a spade. I don't know who's prepping him. I don't know who's trying to get him ready for these TV appearances, but for him to talk about JT playing for Miami last year and then, being SMU's quarterback this year, like for him to not be able to put a coherent sentence together, I don't know if he's suffering from things that other prominent leaders in our country are suffering from with just dementia or whatever is going on in Jim Phillips's mind, but we may need, and obviously we'll just hopefully be out in a year or so and it won't matter. But for him to not even know who quarterbacks are on different teams is it's just really a microcosm of the entire issue with the ACC. And he just slipped up. No, you can't slip up. You're the commissioner of a conference that is fighting for teams to get into the playoff after the greatest injustice of the entire college football just existence happened last year. You're mixing quarterbacks up and you're talking about, just absolutely hilarious and very fitting for Jim Phillips to be the one to go and screw that up this week. So if you haven't heard the clip on him calling, basically every quarterback that played in the ACC for the last 2 years, Jordan Travis, go find that on social media. Richie, give Roback some love, and then we'll talk about one more playoff thing, and we'll wrap up here in a minute.
Yeah, but super excited to have Roback join us in a partnership this year. for the season. I'm actually wearing the Florida State Roback hoodie right now. It's honestly the most comfortable hoodie I've ever worn in my life. They make polos, joggers, shorts, hoodies, obviously. Use our code DFNS20 at roback.com. That's RHOBACK.com. RHOBACK.com. DFNS20. You'll get 20% off your first purchase. Maybe you were pretty upset with Florida State this year and you don't want to buy any Florida State gear. That's cool. Maybe you have a loved one like my wife who is an Alabama fan. They have Alabama gear. Maybe you want just some plain golfing polos. You can get those too. But use our code DFNS20 and for any first-time purchases, we would greatly appreciate it.
So let's wrap up with this today, Richie. Certainly not happy with any injuries that happen, and certainly not going to celebrate any injuries that happen. But I did find it somewhat funny, somewhat strange that we had an injury to a prominent quarterback last night in Carson Beck, who I have a couple of takeaways from this. Immediately when this happened, Matt Baker of now The Athletic, he was with the Tempe Times, and Andy Staples of On3 immediately put out articles of why the Jordan Travis thing is different than the Carson Beck thing. And listen, I can preface this entire segment by saying, yes, I understand that UGA won their conference championship and that gets them an auto bid. However, what would have been the most interesting to me is, Richie, what would have happened had they lost that game?
They would have gotten in.
I mean, there would have been no question that they would have been in. And what's also interesting to me is UGA clearly has an injured quarterback right now, and they didn't drop in the conference champions, right? Like, you still could have said, okay, well, they got in because of their auto bid, but they don't have their quarterback now, so we need to drop them behind the 3 seed or behind the 4 seed. And so the double standard that existed last year all of a sudden just went poof, right? You had different conference champions. UGA has 2 losses. Boise State doesn't have 2 losses. Clemson has 1 more loss than UGA, but they're right there. Arizona State has the same thing. And Kenny even talked about the fact that, well, with their quarterback, they're 11-1. So they actually have less losses than Georgia. And so even with an injured quarterback, UGA still propped up to the number 2 overall seed, maybe just exposes the double standard that was last year even more.
Yeah, and I just pulled it up right now. Gunnar Stockton, who went into relieve Carson Beck when he got injured, threw for 71 yards with an average of 4.4 yards per attempt, 0 touchdowns, 1 interception, a QBR of 63.7. So, yeah, you're going to get me riled up again, TJ, because it's just ridiculous because the way Florida State's defense was playing last year makes no sense. And I stay true to this belief. If Alabama and Texas never played last year, Florida State gets in. They get into the playoff because you could not put one in without the other. And the fact that they played and Texas won. And I do think that Nick Saban retiring was not a secret to the higher ups at ESPN. And they wanted to make sure he got in. So there's just so many things to be frustrated about how Florida State got snubbed last year. And it sucks. And if there was a 12-team playoff, Florida State would have been in it. But I think it was just the perfect snowball of effects that cost Florida State their chance to win a national title last year. And I truly, to this day, think Florida State's defense was playing at a level where they could have been in a game with any of those 4 playoff teams.
What would have been interesting is if they would have done that last year, would they have dropped Florida State like they did Clemson to the 12 seed?
No, right? They would have been 2-3 probably.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that I believe that. Like, I think they would have ranked Florida State lower because your SEC champion or Big Ten was number 1, right? And then you had your 2 seed was Washington. Your 3 seed was Texas. Your 4 seed was Bama for winning the SEC championship. And then would you have made your 5 seed Florida State or your 5th conference champion? Would you have bumped them down to 12 because of the injury to Travis, which obviously would have been a travesty as well, to bump Florida State down that low and make them In that 12 seed, who would they have played? Well, they would have played the 5th seed, which would have been Georgia. You'd have had the same exact matchup that you ended up having in the Orange Bowl. And that's probably where Florida State would have gotten shafted too. I also thought that it was interesting that people are saying, oh, well, Florida State looked terrible after Jordan went down. And they completely discount the fact that Florida State won a 2-score game on the road against an SEC rival, just like Georgia did at a neutral site. They beat their rival, Florida, the same team, by 2 scores. Florida having an injured quarterback and having to go to a backup in that game, just like Florida State had to play against them last year. Same thing, just in the swamp. And then Florida State scored the same number of points that UGA scored last night in regulation. Now, obviously, they had more points because they went to overtime. They scored 16 points, just like Florida State did in their conference championship game with crazy, crazy defense. Florida State was able to win 16-6, whereas Texas and Georgia went 16-16 in the SEC championship in a game that was probably the most underwhelming. It was an exciting game because it went to overtime. Probably the most underwhelming, nothing special game that we saw from the conference championship weekend when you look at the Big Four conferences. Florida State and Georgia scored the same amount of points. Their backups do essentially the same thing. I think Brock had 55 yards. Gunner had 71. Brock didn't throw an interception. Gunner did. And Brock had more rushing yards. So I thought that it was interesting to see the similarities and then understand the biggest difference between the two was the fact that the Florida State players have an ACC patch on their jersey. The Georgia players have an SEC patch on their jersey, and that is the determining factor. I also think what's interesting is I saw some people commenting on this, Richie. There was no way that Kirby was going to come out and say anything about, they could know. Now, I don't know what Beck's prognosis is because Kirby hasn't said anything, but they could have known that Beck was done for the year last night. And I know he came in for the last play and got the handoff. And it encourages, I think this situation, this scenario that they've painted themselves into, ESPN and the playoff committee, it encourages coaches to just down and out to falsify what the truth is, to not be honest, not be upfront. Why would you ever do anything? Yeah, why would you ever do anything but list your quarterback as questionable? You're never going to see a team be honest about this again. Now, when a guy's leg is broken in half on TV, it's a little tough to sugarcoat that or lie about that, but you'll never see a coach or a staff be honest about this again. And we will get scenarios. We will get situations down the road where quarterbacks or big time players, we're all going to know that they were hurt, but the coaches and the staffs and the programs are not going to be honest about it because why would you?
Yeah. So a couple things here. I'm a firm believer that even if Jordan Travis does not break his game or break his leg against North Alabama, I think they would have found a way to leave Florida State out. I don't know what the explanation would have been, but I truly believe Florida State was not getting in because they had to get Alabama in, and you could not put Alabama in without putting Texas in. I just truly believe in that. And I lost my train of thought on what else I was going to say. So just go ahead, TJ.
Yeah, that's pretty much all I have. Again, I think it kind of encourages coaches to lie and be dishonest about it, and I think you'll see more of that. I think I hope Beck's okay, right? Because I want to see good playoff games at this point. I'm certainly not celebrating that he's injured by any means, but if we're calling a spade, obviously there's a double standard, and it has most of it has to do with the conference that guys play in. We all said that last year too. If McCarthy, if any of those quarterbacks on other teams, Bo Nix or just whomever, well, not Nix, but Penix or anybody would have gotten injured, they weren't leaving anybody else out. It was about getting the SEC team in, and that's what they had to do.
It's so I remember what I was going to say now, but it's like for 10 straight years, Tom Brady was always listed as questionable on the injury report, and everyone knew he was going to play every single game. But what if, and again, I just said, I think Florida State gets left out regardless, even going 13-0 last year. But let's say that Mike Norvell puts out an injury report and says, Jordan Travis is probable in the next game. Does he get in for the college football playoff? Does Florida State get in? I don't think so, because again, I don't think Florida State had a chance to get in, because I think last year sucks for Florida State and Florida State fans, but last year was all about Nick Saban. They knew it was his last year, and that's what they decided to do.
Yeah. All right. Now that we've gotten that rant off, we couldn't go a full year without getting that rant off one more time. I do want to tell everybody in here watching, again, up to like 400 people at one point, a little over 350 now. If you're watching, if you could do us a favor and hit the subscribe button, we certainly do appreciate that. We will have a ton of content that comes out. If you missed any part of this video, we'll chop this up into segments and we'll put it out on the channel this week. Richie, what shout outs you got? What you got before we get out of here?
No shout outs today. Just shout out all the listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you.
I don't have too many shout outs either. Shout out everybody around the holiday season. I know people go through tough things, whether it's, just the holidays, or they talked about this in church this morning, so I won't preach at everybody, but we all think about the holidays as a super exciting time and everybody's in a good mood and everybody's happy. But for people that are going through things, whether it be the loss of a loved one, whether it be a strange relationship, whether it just be, stuff your kids are going through, or the holidays are even tougher time because everybody around you is in such a good mood that you're kind of just suffering there by yourself. And so if you are going through something, do think about, there's obviously things much bigger than football. And so my shout out or whatever is just to kind of think about the people that are going through tougher times, try and be a friend to them, kind to them. Think about your lowly Florida State fans that, had to watch their team go through 2 wins this year, just whatever, right? Like obviously the holidays are a very happy time for most people. They're a really tough time if people are going through things. And so, I don't know, just something that stuck with me while we were in church this morning. And obviously there's things that are bigger than football. So we have a platform and try and encourage people. If you are going through something, then message Richie and you can talk with him about it. So that's all I've got. Harlan, Richie, I appreciate you guys for hanging out here on Sunday night.
Seriously, my DMs are open, guys. If you're going through tough times, feel free. I'm not even joking. It can be a hard time. But I appreciate all of y'all.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, we like to make light of stuff and joke about stuff too. But yeah, there's a lot more serious stuff than football at times that people are going through. So appreciate you guys for hanging out. Richie, Harlan, thank you guys for the time. A little over an hour tonight, but a good show. And we'll have a lot more this week. So make sure that you are subscribed. We'll talk to you guys soon. Go Noles.